This is one of my all-time favourite public service announcements. It perfectly demonstrates the concept of Meteor Strikes Earth, women most affected. Yes, both men and women are affected by homelessness, but it's a bigger problem for women even when it isn't. This doesn't really bother me. There are perfectly understandable evolutionary reasons why we prioritise the health and well-being of women. What bothers me is that our popular culture tells us that the situation is the complete opposite, that women are oppressed and that men have privilege, even when basic statistics tell us otherwise. If this constant barrage of misinformation didn't exist, I probably wouldn't have that much of a YouTube channel at all, because there'd be no reason to provide a counter to this and other similar bullshit narratives. And so predictably, whilst it was clear early on in the pandemic that men were more likely to die from COVID-19 than women, headlines like these could be found everywhere. Articles like this from the ABC acknowledged that yes, men were more likely to die from COVID, but it was women that bore the brunt of the economic pain. By the way, in reference to the headline, we should note that women are more likely than men to suffer from anxiety even in a non-pandemic world. That's the normal state of affairs, and thus I would argue redundant. Now, you have to get about halfway through the article to find any real data. Quote, "The social and economic commentator George Megalogenis has dubbed the COVID-19 contraction a pink-collar recession, pointing out that unlike the 1990s recession in which men lost 85% of the jobs and the 1980s recession in which they lost 76% of the jobs, more than half of the direct workforce victims so far in this event are female." More than half, so is it 52% or 82%? I think that makes a difference. If we go to George with the unpronounceable last names article, we find out that this recession breaks the old rules. It was confirmed in an instant, and the burden came with a unique gender bias. Just over half the jobs that have disappeared since March 14 belong to women, based on my calculations of the latest Australian Bureau of Statistics weekly payroll jobs and wages report. The reason women are suffering more than men is they dominate the sectors shut down by the pandemic, yet they are also working harder than ever in those areas of the service economy still open, namely healthcare and social assistance and education and training, where the job losses to date are modest. Those with young children have also enlisted in the cause of homeschooling. The ABS says 8.1% of all jobs held by women and 6.2% of jobs held by men have disappeared since March 14. This suggests the unemployment rates for men and women will diverge sharply, and we will later see that divergence. At the last recession, the male unemployment rate peaked at 12%, 1.5 points higher than the female unemployment rate. You could see this economic and cultural crisis coming from the moment Scott Morrison announced stage 2 of the lockdowns on Sunday, March 22, which closed pubs, cinemas, restaurants, gyms and churches. Both these articles were written in May. Georgie Boy's article was written on May 9th, which means the data he was working off was the March data released in mid-April. The April data wasn't released until May 14th. As we'll see, George jumped the gun a little bit, but we can't blame him too much because, of course, there are plenty of virtue tokens to be collected for being early to the female victimhood narrative. The Australia Institute jumped on this bandwagon via a podcast in June, and as recently as December of 2020, the Senate Select Committee on COVID-19 included a full section on the economic impact on women, in which they claim that Australian women have disproportionately borne the economic impact of the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the National Foundation for Australian Women. As early as June, it was clearly going to be the case that women would bear the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Grattan Institute's submission found that women were economically worse off when compared to other notable demographic groups, while Economic Security for Women highlighted that women have been disproportionately affected during COVID-19. They make up the majority of frontline workers in care and education and are overrepresented in precarious employment, including in the informal sector where their benefits and protection are inadequate or lacking. The Australia Institute identified that the economic data suggested a bias in the system towards dismissing women during the pandemic. When you look at the figures, everyone's answer tends to be, well, accommodation and retail are the areas most recessed, so it follows that women are going to be disproportionately hit. But in fact, when you look at the gender intensity of the industries and adjust for their decline, we should have seen more men hit than women. There's been a bias in the system towards dismissing women in preference to men, or bias towards men. The only problem with this victim narrative is that it runs contrary to empirical evidence. This is the latest report from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They've helpfully included the change in payrolls and wages since March 14th, about a week before stage 2 lockdowns kicked in. In terms of total jobs lost since COVID hit, total payrolls for males are down 3.8% from the pre-COVID peak, whilst female payrolls are down just 2.2%. Meanwhile, male wages are down 4.9%, whilst female wages are basically unchanged. It's true that female payrolls fell further initially, but by June they'd recovered to the same level as male payroll losses, and since October have significantly diverged from the male experience. So men have not only been more likely to die of COVID, they are still more likely to be out of work and had their wages cut. The pink recession appears to have turned blue after all. But don't expect to hear that reported in the media. No, the narrative was useful when it supported their ideological viewpoint, but the facts are now inconvenient and thus will be ignored. And just a small note for the statistically illiterate, because I've heard this a few times now. Yes, it is true in Australia that more women have died of COVID than men. The total number of female deaths from COVID as of December 31st was 469 compared to 440 men. Or put another way, 51.6% of COVID deaths in Australia were females. However, have a look at the distribution of deaths by age group. It's overwhelmingly male under 80 years of age, but over 80, it's majority female. In the over 90 category, 200 women have died as opposed to 115 men. That's 74% more female deaths from COVID in the over 90 category. Now, why is that? Well, there are 89% more women aged over 90 in the general population. I mean, the dating market for men in their 90s is awesome. And for every man aged 100 or older, there are more than 2 women. Look at it another way. There have been 552 recorded cases of COVID in women over the age of 90 and 200 deaths. That means 36% of females that contracted COVID-19 in that age group died from it. For men, there were 229 recorded cases and 115 deaths. So 50% of men in that age group that contracted COVID-19 died from it. And that's the same for every age group. If you get COVID, you're more likely to die from it if you're male. So that's it for this edition of Meteor Strikes Earth, Women Most Affected. As usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.